Arguably the most important part of your landscape photography kit, even more so than your camera, are the lenses that you choose. And this is because your lenses affect everything in a photo. They affect your framing, your composition, which items you include or exclude from a photo, and just the general look and feel of an image. And if you don't have a good enough lens, then you won't be able to get the high image quality that a high-end camera would be capable of. So let's dive into all of the important considerations when you're choosing a lens for landscape photography. When you're choosing a lens for landscape photography, one of the most important considerations is focal length. And this is because you want the largest possible range from ultra-wide to telephoto so that you don't box yourself in. There are going to be situations where you need an ultra-wide lens or a telephoto or something in between, and if you don't have the right one, then that could be a problem. A lot of people think that landscape photography is all about the wide-angle lens, and this does make sense. If you're at a grand vista and you're trying to show the entire scene in your photograph, or if you're trying to emphasize details in your foreground, a wide angle can be a really fantastic tool. But telephotos also work really well, and you shouldn't overlook them. For example, if you're trying to photograph a scene with tighter framing and you want to magnify something in the distance, telephotos are amazing. Personally, I actually use telephoto lenses even more than I use wide angles for photography, so they're definitely not something that you should overlook. As you're looking through lenses for landscape photography, you'll come across all sorts of extremes. You might find a relatively inexpensive lens that zooms from wide angle to telephoto all at once, or you could find a prime lens that costs several thousands of dollars even though it doesn't zoom. On top of this, some photographers might choose one or maybe two lenses to fill their kit, while others have an entire set. It all depends upon your personal needs. In addition to these considerations, there's also things like aperture, weight, weather sealing, and a lot of other things that you need to think about when you're choosing a lens. So let's talk about each one of these a little bit more specifically. So first up are wide-angle lenses, and these are very popular tools for landscape photography. Now, what is it about wide-angle lenses that makes a lot of landscape photographers like them so much? Well, the most obvious reason is they get a lot of the scene in the photo at once. Now, you might hear some photographers tell you not to use wide-angle lenses like this, because if you use a wide-angle lens with the only goal being capturing the entire scene in a single photo, then you might not be composing your photographs very thoughtfully. If you simply turn your lens to its widest setting and capture everything on autopilot, you probably won't capture very good photos. But at the same time, this is a very valid reason to use wide-angle lenses depending upon the scene. For example, if you're taking pictures with really cool clouds over a valley, or you're taking pictures at night with the Milky Way stretching across the frame, you simply wouldn't be able to capture the entire subject without using a wide angle. The other main reason to use wide-angle lenses for landscape photography is if you're trying to emphasize your foreground. So how does this look? Well, wide-angle lenses can be so wide that they capture a lot of information that's near your camera. If you're not careful, you might even get your own feet in the frame. And that's certainly not something that would happen if you used a telephoto lens. So how can you use this effect to your advantage in practice? Well, say that you've got a flower that's in your foreground and mountains that are in the distance, and you want that flower to appear relatively large compared to the background. A good way to do this would be to put on the widest lens that you can, get down near the flower, and take the picture. The final image will have a relatively large flower compared to relatively small mountains, and could be exactly the effect that you're after. Chances are good that you'll come across a number of situations like this when you're out in the real world practicing landscape photography. Next up are telephoto lenses, and in many ways these lenses are the exact opposite of wide angles. While a wide-angle lens might emphasize elements in your foreground, a telephoto can emphasize elements in your background. So say that you're taking pictures at some interesting cliffs that are in the distance. If you use a telephoto, you can make those cliffs take up a significant portion of your frame. That, again, is not the case with a wide angle. And similarly, while a wide angle might include a lot of information that's near your camera and a lot of nearby elements, a telephoto can actually let you exclude them. So if there's grass or anything else in your foreground that you don't like, a telephoto is a very useful tool. And along those same lines, a telephoto lets you be more specific in where you frame your composition. Say that there's some power lines going over a hill in your photograph. If you have a wide-angle lens, you might have no choice but to include them in your photo. But if you have a telephoto, you have a little bit more room to maneuver around them and compose your photo in a way that doesn't include them. And these aren't weaknesses of a telephoto. These are the reasons why a lot of landscape photographers choose them for their own photography. In between wide-angle and telephoto lenses are the normal focal length lenses, and these are very common in photography. If you've been taking pictures for a while, you may have one or two lying around. But can you take good landscape photos with a normal lens? Well, the answer is, of course you can. You can take good landscape photos with any focal length lenses. But it is true that these are not the most common lenses for landscape photography. And that's just because they don't give you giant foregrounds, and they don't emphasize distant objects, like a wide angle or a telephoto might. They just have some elements of both. But that doesn't make them bad lenses. And if you are personally interested in shooting that type of focal length, which is a very natural focal length, then you might enjoy normal lenses more than you would prefer wide angles or telephotos. This is all up to your personal preferences, but the best way to test it is just to go out in the field yourself with a wide array of lenses and see what you gravitate towards. As you can see, there are a lot of focal lengths that work really well for landscape photography, but that's not the only consideration that you should have when you're choosing a lens. One of the other important ones is whether you have a prime versus a zoom lens. And the main thing here is just whether you cover multiple focal lengths in a single lens, like a zoom, or whether you have to have multiple prime lenses to cover the same range. Now, it's not as simple as just one lens that covers a large range versus several prime lenses to cover the same range, because there are other considerations that you need to keep in mind as well. For example, prime lenses tend to be significantly smaller and lighter than comparable zoom lenses. And for a given quality, prime lenses are also often less expensive. Now, zoom lenses might be larger and heavier and even more expensive than prime lenses, but there's also the convenience factor that you have to keep in mind. It's really nice just to walk out with a single lens on your camera and capture a wide range of views, rather than having to carry along a bag with multiple prime lenses. Even though each individual prime may be lighter, a set of them can weigh just as much, if not more, than a comparable zoom. Ultimately, whichever one you choose depends upon your personal preferences, but again, there is no bad option. Another thing you'll notice when you're comparing lenses is the size of their maximum aperture. For example, a lot of prime lenses will have a larger maximum aperture than a comparable zoom. They might have f1.8 rather than f2.8 or f4. Now, you might not think that a large aperture matters particularly for landscape photography, but depending upon what you're photographing, it actually can be a pretty big deal. For example, whenever I take pictures at night, I always want a lens with the largest possible maximum aperture to let in as much light as possible. If I'm trying to capture dim stars that are moving across the sky, something like f4 probably won't be bright enough to get exactly the photo that I want. But f2.8 or even f1.8 would be much, much better, and I could end up with an astrophoto that's pretty well exposed. Speaking of low light conditions, as a landscape photographer, it's very likely that you'll be taking pictures when it's pretty dark out, even if you're not actually photographing the night sky. For example, if it's before sunrise or after sunset, the light can still actually be pretty good. There just isn't that much of it, which can make it difficult to focus. Having a wide maximum aperture makes it easier for your camera to focus just because it delivers more light to your sensor. On top of that, some photographers, even though it's not particularly common, would prefer to have a large aperture on their lens because they like having out-of-focus details in their landscapes. Now again, this isn't the classic high-detail, high-resolution landscape, but for certain artistic images, it can work pretty well. Ultimately, having a wide maximum aperture might not be the first thing on your mind when you're picking a lens for landscape photography, but it can actually be surprisingly important. So what is it that makes a lens work particularly well for landscape photography? You might end up looking at the market and seeing 2 or 3 lenses that are very different prices, but seem to do a similar job. But there really is a difference between low quality and high quality lenses for landscape photography. The most obvious difference is just their build quality. Are these lenses built to withstand the elements? As a landscape photographer, you'll find yourself out in the middle of nowhere where it's pounding rain or snow or a sandstorm, and you want equipment that doesn't break or malfunction. At the same time, you'll end up taking pictures hopefully over several years, and if that's the case, then your gear will get bumped around on roads or while you're hiking. And if you have a particularly good lens, it'll be able to withstand all of that and perform just as well after several years of hard use. Along with build quality, there are a lot of other important considerations when you're choosing a lens. Some of them might be just the physical features that your lens offers. For example, maybe your lens has vibration reduction or image stabilization. And you might not think that this is useful for landscape photography if, say, you're using a tripod, but it can be very helpful for handheld shooting or even if you're shooting in high winds. I actually use the vibration reduction feature on my lens fairly often, just depending upon the weather conditions. Along with that, there are a number of other build considerations on your lens that matter for landscape photography. For example, there's the focus throw of your lens. And this is, if you're manually focusing, how far the focusing ring turns on your lens to go from the closest to the farthest focusing distance. For example, if I have a lens where just a quarter turn makes it go all the way from the closest to the farthest distance, it's not very precise, and it'll be very difficult to manually focus on the correct spot. But if I have a lens that turns all the way 100% around in order to go from the closest to the farthest focusing distance, it's very precise and it can work really well for manual focusing. Along the same lines, there are also some lenses, although it is a little bit more rare these days, that have a hard stop focusing point at infinity, which means that you can turn the lens all the way to the end and it gives you perfect focus at exactly the farthest distances. And this can be very useful for things like nighttime photography, where it can be very difficult to focus. All you need to do is just turn your lens to the infinity focus and you'll get very sharp stars. Finally, it's also an important build consideration to see if your lens takes filters. Now, most lenses do take filters, which is nice because they have a native filter thread that you can just screw a filter directly onto. But some lenses are a little bit bulkier or they have strange front elements, and they don't natively take filters. And they do end up having the ability to use filters if you have an external holder, but that can be large and expensive and inconvenient. So ultimately, if you have a lens that does allow you to use filters natively with its own filter thread, that's better. And another useful feature that some lenses have for landscape photography is the ability to tilt their plane of focus. Now what this means is that instead of the plane of focus being parallel to your camera sensor, you can actually tilt it so that it's in line with the landscape. And this is very useful. For example, if you're trying to include the foreground and the background both as sharp as possible, it's very easy to tilt the plane of focus so that it intersects with both. These are called tilt-shift lenses. And you can also accomplish a similar effect with a normal lens by attaching it to a bellows system. But the end result is a very sharp landscape, even at wider apertures than you would normally be able to use for landscape photography. While tilt-shift lenses can be very useful for landscape photography, they aren't perfect. Unfortunately, because they're such specialized tools, they tend to be very expensive. They're also manual focus only and pretty difficult to use. Personally, I don't even have a tilt-shift lens because I don't deal with that many situations where my foreground is so close to the lens that I find it almost impossible to get it and the background to be sharp at the same time. However, if this sounds like a scenario that you run across all the time and you're willing to put in the effort for a tilt-shift lens, these can be wonderful specialized tools to use for your own landscape photography. As landscape photographers, we're always interested in getting more detail in our photographs so that they look as sharp as possible. And as you would expect, the lens that you choose has a significant impact on the amount of detail in your final photos. So why is this? Well, when manufacturers are designing their lenses, they can choose to correct for certain optical problems by adding in corrective elements to their lens. However, this also makes the lens more expensive because the manufacturing process can be very complex. This is one thing that separates high-end lenses from lower-end lenses. Specifically, these corrective elements can improve the resolving power of a lens, which is a very tricky problem, particularly in the edges of a photograph, where things are much more difficult to correct. Ultimately, one of the most important differences between a high-end lens and a low-end lens are the optical corrections that it employs. Now, when you're out in the field taking pictures at different aperture values, you might notice that some of your photos are sharper than others using the same lens. And this is because every lens has a sweet spot. And the sweet spot is the range of apertures or the specific aperture where the lens resolves the most detail. For example, if you have a lens that's built for a full-frame camera, the sweet spot might be from f5.6 to f8, although this obviously depends upon the specific design of your lens. Ultimately, it's a good idea to do some research, either testing the lens yourself or looking it up online to find the sweet spot of your lens so that you can take advantage of it in the field. When you're selecting a lens, one of the other important characteristics to consider is the quality of coatings that it has. Now, the coatings of a lens affect a number of areas of its performance, most importantly, how well it does with flare. And this is a very important consideration for landscape photographers because you'll often be shooting against the sun or even against the moon at night, and you could end up with a lot of flare or ghosting that harms your photos. But if you get a lens that has good coatings and a successful lens design, then you'll end up minimizing this and improving the quality of your photos in these conditions. Another quality that matters when you're shooting against the sun is the quality of the starburst effect in your photos. So what are starbursts? Well, as you can see in this photo, there are well-defined rays of light branching out from the sun, and this is a successful starburst effect. To get an effect like this, you'll have to get a number of things right in camera. Specifically, this starburst effect happens because a very bright point of light interacts with the aperture blades in your lens. So you'll want to use a small aperture, something like f11 or f16, in order to get the most defined rays of light. Along with that, you'll also want to photograph very small and bright sources of light, such as the sun as it's dipping below the horizon. Finally, the lens that you use also has a significant effect on the quality of your starbursts. For example, the number of aperture blades in your lens, as well as the shape of your aperture blades, whether they're straight versus rounded, can have a significant impact on the quality of your starburst effect. Now, you won't end up with the starburst effect in every single one of your landscape photos, but if you like how it looks, this is something that you should pay attention to when you're choosing a lens. Most of the optical problems you'll find are a result of the spherical nature of lenses. The sensor in your camera is flat, and it's very difficult for manufacturers to design a lens that projects light perfectly onto a flat sensor. This is also why you'll end up with very expensive lenses that have a lot of corrective elements to try to minimize these lens problems, or lens aberrations. So what are some of the common lens aberrations that you might find, and how do they impact your landscape photography? In some photos, you may look at hard edges near the sides of your frame and notice halos of purple, green, or some other color. And this is known as lateral chromatic aberration, and it can be pretty distracting. But the good news is that it's very easy to correct lateral chromatic aberrations in most post-processing software. Usually you can do this just with one click, and if not, there are almost always manual options available. Ultimately, unless your lens has particularly high levels of this aberration, you won't really notice it in the corrected image. Field curvature is another aberration that you'll find in some lenses, and this one is also very important to landscape photography. For example, if you're taking pictures of a flat object that's parallel to your camera sensor, a lens with high field curvature might mean that parts of it are blurry, even though normally they should be completely sharp. For example, if you're taking pictures at an overlook and there's nothing in your foreground, you'll probably be focused in the distance. And if your lens has high field curvature, focusing at the center point in the image might make the center of the photo look perfectly sharp, but the edges could be blurry. And this isn't because you have a bad lens, it's because those edges are actually out of focus. So what would happen if you took that focusing point and you moved it from the center of the frame to the edge and then refocused? Well, in that case, the effect would be the exact opposite. You might end up with the edges of your frame that are sharp, while the center is blurry because it is out of focus. If this is the case for you, then you know that your lens has high field curvature. And unfortunately, you can't really do that much to correct for field curvature. One of the best options that you have is simply to use a smaller aperture so that you have the greatest possible depth of field. At the same time, there might be cases where the center of the photo looks good, and a lot of the rest of the image looks good as well, but maybe one of the corners or two of the corners are blurrier than the others. And if this is true, that's not field curvature. That's something known as decentering. What could happen is, after using your lens for several years and bumping it around, or dropping your lens perhaps, then the elements inside of the lens could get misaligned. And if this happens, you really can't do very much to correct for it. One of the best things that you can do is simply just to send it back to the manufacturer for a repair. There's another aberration that you might notice while you're taking pictures, especially if you're photographing the night sky, and this is known as coma. So coma is when bright points of light, like stars, start to smear into cone shapes, particularly when they're near the edges of your frame. This is also why a lot of astrophotographers buy lenses specifically designed to minimize coma. The best way to correct for this aberration is just to purchase a lens that doesn't have very much of it. Some lenses also exhibit a problem that's known as focus shift, and in this case, as you stop down your lens, even without messing with your focusing, the actual plane of focus in your image can change. Now, a lot of landscape photographers might not notice this effect simply because they'll be using such small apertures that their depth of field is large enough to mask any slight focus changes. At the same time, some camera manufacturers these days are building in corrections for focus shift into their cameras. At the same time, if you can, and if you have enough light, you might as well open up live view, set the aperture to exactly what you're planning to use to take the photo, and then focus that way, just to eliminate any possibility of focus shift. Also, there might be some situations where you're photographing straight lines, like the horizon, but they actually appear to be curved in your photo. And this is because your lens simply has some distortion. This is a very common optical problem, and luckily it's also quite easy to correct in software. Most software these days has an automatic distortion correction or manual options, and either way it's not that big of a deal. In conclusion, when you're choosing a lens, there are a number of optical factors that you need to pay attention to. Now, we might not have covered absolutely everything, but these are some of the most important considerations specifically for landscape photography. So now that you know what to look for in a lens, let's dive into some specific examples of how these factors apply in practice. Right now, I have 3 lenses in front of me, and each of these are very good options for landscape photography. In fact, each of these lenses is actually a part of the kit that I use day to day. So what is it about these lenses that makes them so good for landscape photography, and specifically, what lenses even are they? Well, this is an ultra-wide-angle zoom, and this is a telephoto zoom, and this is a wide-angle prime. And each one of them has some pros and cons that would make me choose one over the other depending upon the situation. So first up is this Nikon 14 to 24mm f2.8 lens, and this is a professional grade lens that's very well known for landscape photography for a number of reasons. Most importantly, at 14mm, it is extremely wide. This thing can capture an enormous amount of the landscape and also emphasize your foregrounds really well. At the same time, it has a pretty wide aperture of f2.8, which is very rare for a zoom, especially one that's this wide. And this is particularly useful for nighttime photos, like if you're trying to take pictures of the Milky Way, because that wide aperture lets in a lot of light. Personally, when I'm trying to take pictures of the Milky Way, I turn this lens to 14mm so that I can capture as much of the sky as possible, and I set it to f2.8 so that I capture the brightest possible stars. When I do that, I can end up getting really nice Milky Way photos that just aren't possible with very many other lenses on the market. At the same time, it has some flaws. Obviously, this is a very big and heavy lens, and it doesn't allow you to take filters because of its large front element. This is why there are other wide-angle lenses on the market, such as this 20mm f1.8 lens, also by Nikon. One benefit of this 20mm f1.8 is that it's much lighter and it's also smaller. So personally, if I'm going on a long-distance hike, I might even leave this large lens at home and only take the smaller 20mm instead. Also, this 20mm lens takes filters, which can be incredibly useful, if not essential, for landscape photography. For example, if you're trying to photograph a scene with a polarizer or a graduated neutral density filter, then this lens makes it really easy. However, this lens can still take filters. The only problem with it is the filters, as well as the filter holder, tend to be very large and expensive, and you have to go through third-party options. Personally, that's one of the main reasons why I keep both lenses around. If I come across a scene that needs a good filter, I always default to my 20. In addition to these physical differences between the two lenses, there are also optical characteristics where each performs a little differently. For example, as sharp as the 14 to 24mm lens is, I've never found it to be particularly good for flare. Whenever I'm taking pictures with the sun in the frame, I'll often end up with strong ghosting that can potentially even ruin the image. Also, the starburst effects on this lens when the sun is just dipping below the horizon aren't particularly strong, even at something like f16. However, the 20mm lens outperforms it on both of these factors, despite being a less expensive lens and an enthusiast-grade lens rather than a professional-grade lens. And there are other differences between these two lenses as well. For example, the 20mm lens is an f1.8, while the 14 to 24 is an f2.8. That means that the 20mm lets in more than a stop extra light. So if 20mm is an acceptable focal length, and I'm trying to capture as much light as possible, it's the one that I pick by default. At the same time, the 14 to 24mm is known for exhibiting a little bit of focus shift when you stop down the aperture, while I've never noticed such a thing on the 20mm f1.8. So in various situations like this, each lens does have its own pros and cons. Essentially, the reason why I keep both in my kit is that the negatives of one are the positives of the other. The 14 to 24mm is very heavy, it doesn't take filters, it doesn't have great flare performance, while the 20mm is light, it takes filters, and it does really well when the sun is in the frame. But the 20mm is fixed, and it doesn't go all the way as wide as the 14 to 24. So each one definitely has a place in my kit. Now, some people might argue that a prime lens like this 20mm is very similar to a zoom lens like this 14 to 24mm because you can always just zoom with your feet. However, this is a very mistaken assumption. Anytime that you move forwards or backwards, you change the relative sizes of everything in your photo. So say that you're taking a picture of a mountain landscape with a rock in the foreground, and you want to make the rock appear larger. Well, when you do that with a 20mm lens, you might just walk forward a few steps, and then the rock takes up a very large amount of the frame. However, the mountains in the distance might not change at all. This means that the rock would be proportionally much larger than the mountains. Your perspective would be very different. However, if you had this 14 to 24 and you just zoomed in, both the rock and the mountain would magnify at exactly the same rate. so proportionally, they wouldn't change at all. Ultimately, this is one major reason why you might want to use zooms, which give you a little bit more flexibility in which subjects you magnify in a given photo. And one more argument for a zoom lens is if you're standing at an overlook and you can't really move your feet, then the zoom lens still lets you magnify the objects in your photo. So ultimately, it's very useful to have a zoom in your kit, just so that you have a little bit more flexibility. The last lens I have here is the Nikon 70-200 f4, and this is also a very good lens for landscape photography. Specifically, it offers a counterpoint to these two lenses because I can zoom in and have tighter compositions. It's also nice for things like panoramas, because I can take a lot of shots and have significant levels of detail. At the same time, this lens also has another feature that these two don't, and that's vibration reduction, or image stabilization. Now, when I'm shooting handheld, having that option is very useful for using lower shutter speeds. And even when I'm using a tripod, I'll still turn on the vibration reduction feature of this lens, depending upon the conditions. For example, if it's windy and my tripod's shaking, I've found that at certain shutter speeds, the vibration reduction feature definitely improves the quality of the photo. Now, this lens also has a bigger brother, and that's the 70-200 f2.8. Now, even though these two lenses have the exact same focal length, the apertures are different, and that's why the f2.8 version is larger, heavier, and more expensive. And those are 3 good reasons not to use that lens for landscape photography and to prefer the little brother instead. But the other reason is I simply don't need the f2.8. In this case, I'm going to be stopped down anyway, and if both lenses are stopped down, there's really no benefit to the extra stop of light. So all of these are considerations that you should keep in mind when you're choosing your own landscape photography lenses. As you can see, these 3 are all very good lenses for landscape photography. I'm covering the wide angle and the telephoto pretty well, but I'm still missing the range in the middle. And this is a good spot to potentially put a 24-70 zoom or maybe a couple of primes. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter which specific lenses you choose so long as you don't limit yourself. You don't have to cover every single millimeter exactly, so long as you leave yourself with enough options to capture exactly the photo that you have in mind. In conclusion, the lenses that you use are crucial to landscape photography. I've covered some specific examples of lenses, as well as the considerations that you should have in mind while you're choosing a lens. So be sure to use this information while you're looking through lenses and selecting the right ones to use in the field.